The scriptures teach us that we are involved in a spiritual war, not one that will be fought with physical weapons, but one that will be fought in an invisible realm, one that will be fought with prayer and proclamation. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 tells us that the enemy is in the business of blinding and deceiving the nations. It says the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the gospel that displays the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. We need to realize that Satan and the demonic are organized and intentional. In 2 Corinthians 2, Paul says, "For we are not unaware of his schemes." And in Ephesians, he speaks of the wiles of the devil. The words schemes and wiles show us that the enemy has plans and strategies. The enemy is vigorously working against human flourishing. In John 10, Jesus said that the thief comes to kill, steal, and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it more abundantly. So for human flourishing to take place, we'll need to overcome supernatural resistance to the gospel of the kingdom. In Ephesians 6 it says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." The good news is that the Lord has given us the spiritual weaponry, the tools to overcome the darkness. Luke 10 says, "I've given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. And nothing will harm you. Nothing will by any means harm you." When it comes to the reality of the demonic, the church tends to be either too focused on darkness or oblivious and unaware, depending on their theological tradition. When I say too focused, I mean that some are focused on this to the extent that they don't realize the other barriers are also at work. As a result, they think spiritual warfare is the solution for everything. This is like trying to remove a screw with a hammer. There's probably a better tool. I remember a situation we had in a West African country, and one of the national church planters was frustrated by the lack of fruit he was experiencing while working in a Muslim village. When asked about the challenges of reaching this village, he responded, "The spirit of Islam is just too strong here. We've prayed and fasted and done everything, but there's just no breakthrough." Well, wait a second. Too strong? If Jesus has all authority in heaven and on earth, how can that be? So, with a little more investigation, it was discovered that this brother was raising pigs in his backyard. He came from a tribe that loved pork, and it turned out that the barrier he was facing was not supernatural at all, but instead it was a cultural barrier. The solution wasn't to pray and fast more, but get rid of the pigs. His failure to understand the cultural and religious taboo of pork and his failure to contextualize his message culturally caused frustration. It actually gave him an inflated opinion of the devil's power. It's like the saying, if all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. On the other extreme, there are those believers who have very little awareness of the supernatural and thus try to find natural solutions to supernatural problems. They are similarly frustrated because they're not using the spiritual weapons that the Lord has provided the church. Now, it's beyond the scope of this lesson to deal with the topic of prayer and spiritual warfare thoroughly, but instead I want to just point out the strategic importance of dealing with this barrier. Nevertheless, I would like to touch on the topic briefly and give you a few principles. As a world changer, what we need to do is discern the strongholds. Know when you're up against spiritual forces in your efforts to bring transformation. Realize that these spiritual forces work based on certain legalities, things like cultic worship, generational strongholds, demonic lies and lie-based ideologies, wounds and corruptions in the culture and society. All of these give the enemy a foothold in peoples and institutions. So we need to deal with these things that enable the enemy to keep his grip on the peoples and institutions. Here are a few principles on prayer. Our prayers should be strategic, sustained, and specific. First of all, strategic. In Jeremiah chapter 1, God tells Jeremiah, "See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. I see a prayer strategy in these verses. They tell us what to pray for. We need to pray strategically. This means to call forth heaven's vision. Thy kingdom come, Lord. Your will be done, Lord. Tear down and uproot those things that are evil, backwards, and broken. Build and plant those things that are righteous, good, and holy. Second, sustained prayer. Pray until you get the assurance that the breakthrough has happened. Praying is not just something you can do to check the box and say, okay, we prayed. Now that's out of the way, we can get on to the more important things. Now, I used to hear mature saints talk about praying through. What they meant by praying through is that they would pray until they discerned that the situation was settled in heaven, and a sense of peace and joy and thanksgiving overtook them, and they knew it was settled. Finally, pray specifically. For example, don't just pray for better education. Pray specifics. Pray for teachers and admin and students. But when you're praying for teachers, what kind of teachers are you asking God to bring into the school and raise up? Ask God that those teachers would do or say certain things. In Mark 10, Jesus could see that Bartimaeus was blind. He could see it. It was obvious. But he still asked him to be specific with his request. The blind man was crying out, "Have mercy on me." But Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" I also believe that it is key that we establish praying groups, praying communities in strategic places, in businesses and institutions and in government. When God has placed certain people in certain places, He also gives them a greater spiritual authority in that place. So, World Changer, let's be a people of prayer.